All right, what words come to mind when you think of climate change? Just shout them out.
Scary.
Global warming.
Bad. Flood.
CO2 emissions.
Imminent.
All right, now think of something that you do to positively impact the environment. Once you have an answer, just shout it out.
Reuse.
Recycling.
Carpool.
Composting.
Water conservation.
Drive electric vehicles.
Eat vegetarian.
All right, now what's something that you could be doing to help the environment?
Buy less stuff.
Solar panels.
Bike more.
Be vegetarian.
Vegetarian.
Be vegan.
Get an electric car.
Go be vegan.
All right, hello, my name is Caeley McClain, and welcome to my TED Talk. So as we saw there's a gap between somebody knowing about climate change and actually taking action on climate change. And that's what I'd like to dive in today. So for the past few months, I've been investigating the question, what are the most effective methods to get uninvolved people to take initial action on climate change? So why should we even take action? Well, the concentration of carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere are the highest they've ever been in 650,000 years. Currently, it's 411 parts per million and continues to increase. During the Industrial Revolution and in the 1800s, the carbon dioxide levels were around 280 parts per million. 18 out of the 19 warmest years ever recorded have occurred since 2001. And the global temperature has increased 1.9 degrees Fahrenheit since 1880. The Arctic sea ice is declining 12.8% per decade, and the global sea level sheet mass is losing mass by a rate of 413 gigatons. So due to our Earth's polar ice sheets losing mass and melting, our Earth's global sea level is increasing 32 millimeters per year. And actually over the past 100 years, the global sea level has risen nearly 7 inches. So due to these different effects, we are seeing more frequent and intense floods, wildfires, storms, droughts, and heat waves. And then to make matters worse, the shifting in weather patterns and increased temperature is causing environments to change rapidly, faster than species can evolve or relocate, so leading to the extinction and endangerment of a multitude of animal and plant species. So why aren't we taking action? Well, this is a huge and complicated issue, and there's two factors that come into play. One is our social norms are outdated, and two is the current framing of climate change leads to negative response. So raise your hand if you guys wait in line instead of cut in front of everybody.
I'm just going to be honest.
Now, raise your hand if you say please and thank you. Raise your hand if you say bless you when someone sneezes. Alright, well, all of these are social norms. Social norms are the existence and expectation of a behavior regularity in a population. So an individual in this population is aware of that expectation or behavior regularity. This norm is seen as a given, fixed, a pre-existing external social reality. An individual's right versus wrong is driven by these certain norms. So social norms have a huge influence over an individual's beliefs and behaviors. An individual might conform to a social norm due to a combination of desires. So an individual might decide to conform to a social norm because they don't want to receive social punishment from either breaking that norm or not even following that norm. In society, we have this want to fit in without feeling judgment. So we change who we are or what we believe. So individuals want to learn and adapt to these social norms. And they can learn and adapt to these social norms by observing the behaviors others endorse or approve, while ignoring the behaviors that they see result in neglect. And so people are motivated to adapt and learn these new social norms because they don't want to receive that social punishment. They don't want to feel that judgment. So social norms are like clay. They are super flexible, they can be remolded and changed. But sometimes they need a little nudge from an outside force. So individuals, such as that are in leadership, play a huge role in shaping social norms. So role models and celebrities can act as these role models and actually shift the social norm, thus changing the behavior of individuals. So if somebody in a powerful position in our community acts a certain way or has a certain viewpoint on something, we assume that those actions and those views help them rise in the social realm, so we emulate them. So individuals in our country that have a high presence need to take a stand and speak up about climate change. Individuals such as sports stars to intellects need to speak up and take a pledge towards more pro-environmental behavior. And so once these role models start speaking about what they're doing to reduce their carbon emissions and how they're helping the environment, and then also educating their followers on what the actual issue is and how climate change, like what climate change is, how climate change is impacting our world, and how climate change is impacting their life, then the follower will see like, oh, this is a big issue. But then they need to move towards the solutions. So the follower can see what they can do in their own life. They need to see how they can implement these solutions to their life to reduce their own carbon footprint and have a positive impact on the environment. Laws and regulations also wield influence over individuals. So when we establish a law or a regulation, it can actually change behavior, and then that changed behavior becomes this new norm. So in November of 2006, residents in Boulder, Colorado passed a carbon tax. So carbon tax is a tax on electricity consumption with deductions from electricity from renewable energy. So in 2015, the carbon emissions were reduced by over 100,000 tons per year. And then the City Office of Environmental Affairs infused the $1.8 million of tax revenue back into their community through bike lanes and less carbon-intensive energy and further investments in research towards green energy. Then in May 2008, 4 counties in the San Francisco Bay Area also passed a carbon tax on businesses of 4.4 cents per ton. So the New York State Energy Research and Development attributes the decrease in carbon emissions to fuel switch from petroleum and coal to less carbon-intensive energy and less electricity demand, as well as more capacity for renewable and nuclear energy. So from this data, it's clear that carbon tax actually changed behavior and lowered the carbon dioxide emissions. So for the public to see the urgency of this issue, the government needs to push for more pro-environmental laws and regulations. For example, creating a carbon tax to reduce carbon emissions, reducing cost on recycling in communities, reducing parking and creating more car sharing programs, and then creating public transportation more convenient, to make it more convenient for others in the community, and then making building codes so that building is more sustainable. And then with these different laws and regulations, we need to have public messaging around them that kind of tells a story to push people to help with the issue of climate change, such as riding your bike, recycling, using public transportation, carpooling, turning down your thermostat, having Meatless Monday, followed by Tofu Tuesday. And then, so all of these regulations, laws, regulations, public messaging, and social norms, when they come together, they can actually change behavior to become more pro-environmental. So now that we've kind of gone over social norms and how they affect people's want to take action on climate change and how we can kind of change them, I want to get into how we frame climate change. So I want you guys to look at these different headlines and shout out different emotions that these evoke.
Overwhelmed.
Panic.
Despondence.
Hopeless and depressing, yeah.
The sea is leading.
So the current framing of climate change as onslaught or catastrophe kind of focuses our attention on the unsolvable global tragedy. So the way in which we form an issue actually creates different emotions and different responses. So when we frame something in a negative manner, it affects the individual's response and doesn't implement long-lasting pro-environmental behavior. So when something is framed negatively, fear arises because they might feel like they're in physical harm. And then that fear can lead to a variety of emotions, such as anxiety and stress. And if a person has anxiety or is stressed about an issue, they tend to then avoid that issue. Because when we feel like something is going to affect our life or an aspect of our life, subconscious roadblocks come into play. So your brain actually blocks out that issue so you don't get stressed or anxious. So people have a finite amount of worry. For example, during the global financial crisis, Americans who believed climate change was a very serious problem dropped from a steady 47% to 35%. So due to people being stressed about climate change or about the global financial crisis, they couldn't take on the stress of climate change as well. So targeting negative emotions leads to single action, whereas when framing uses positive emotions, it's more likely to produce a virtuous cycle of pro-environmental behavior. Now I want you guys to look at these headlines and shout out different emotions that these evoke.
Progress.
Hope.
Optimism.
Could make a difference.
That's right. So positive framing creates a sense of hope and optimism. So when we frame something in a positive manner, we feel like we can do something about it and that there are solutions there to solve the issue. We don't feel like our life is being threatened and that we will have an impact for things that we are doing. So a study conducted by Cornell University actually examined how different framing affects humans. So they used fear-based framing, human-based framing, species-based framing, and hope-based framing. The fear-based framing focused more on expressing climate change as a danger to humans and species, and then the positive framing with the hope-based framing ignored the negative impacts and focused more on the potential to mitigate carbon emissions and what we can positively do to have an impact. So they tested these different frameworks on 3,456 participants, and by including fear-based framing, negative-based framing with positive-based framing, they were able to conclude that the hope-based framing was actually superior at creating interest and intention to take reasonable action towards climate change. So sometimes just the availability of solutions from framing and norms is enough for an individual to want to take action. Earlier this year, the United States Environmental Protection Agency started a program called H2O Hotel Challenge, where to reduce water consumption. And so they input water-efficient faucets, shower heads, and toilets, and then encouraged the hotels to give their guests an option to reuse their towels and sheets through these little signs that are all over the United States hotels. So some behavioral scientists decided to come together and try and figure out how the wording of the sign would affect people's want to reuse their towel. So one sign here on the left focused more on the standard industry environmental concern and said, help save the environment. You can show your respect for nature and help save the environment by reusing your towel. And then the other sign on the right focused more on social norms and said, join your fellow guests in helping save the environment. Over 75% of guests, by participating in our new resource program, do help by reusing their towel. You can join your fellow guests by reusing your towel during your stay. So over a span of 80 days, they collected data on the guests with the social conforming sign and the environmental concerning sign to see which guests reused their towel more often. And the results showed that the guests with the social conforming sign actually reused their towel at a significantly higher rate than those with an environmental concern sign. And then in a second experiment, they found when they focused on the guests in that specific room reusing their towel as opposed to the amount of guests in the entire hotel that reused their towel, motivated that guest in that room to reuse their towel a lot more. So before I investigated this topic, I would always frame climate change very negatively. I would always look at how we are killing all of these species and how all of these animals are going extinct and pikas are being stranded on these mountains and we as humans are just terrible and we're just killing everything and it's awful. And this made me really stressed. It made me feel like I couldn't really do anything and the stuff that I wasn't doing didn't have an impact. But then I realized there is hope. There is still a chance to make a difference if we all come together. So now when I have a conversation, I try to frame our conversation more around the solutions. I try to look more at like what I could be doing or what I am doing to reduce my carbon emissions, as well as talk to them about what they're doing and what solutions they can implement in their own life to reduce their carbon emissions. So doing the smallest things like that may not seem like much, but it leads to significant change. We can all do something to restore our planet to the way it should be, but it's going to take all of us. The solutions are right in front of us. All this needs now is you. You may be thinking, what next? How can I really make a difference? But whether you're a scientist, a professional athlete, a student, or a teacher, you have a big hand in this. The Earth can no longer restore itself on its own, and it needs our help right now. So, I'm going to reuse my towel. Are you? I'm going to continue to speak up about climate change. Are you? And when I talk about climate change, I'm going to focus on the solutions rather than the doom and gloom. Are you? Thank you.
That was an intense ending.
Ethan's a little shaken. So we're going to open it up to questions. Audience members, please feel free to raise your hands if you have any questions. And then panelists, obviously, you as well.
Yeah.
Was that a threat?
Not at all.
Would a threat work?
I don't know.
Yeah.
This is a huge problem,
Yeah.
and I think you summarized the research very well. But how we've got this really narrow window of time we're working in. How do we take hope and couple it with like the real urgency and time-sensitive nature of the decisions we're having to make?
I mean, I think we just have to realize that like everything that we do has impacts, and that these animals do have a time limit. And so kind of just keeping that in our mindset, but also thinking like, oh, like we can actually do something about it, and we can start restoring their ecosystem, and that'll help them. Kind of keeping like, yes, we're on a time limit, but having that hope around, like we can do something about it. Does that kind of answer?
Yeah, I get what would in terms of like reframing social norms or government action. What do you think are the 1 to 3 most important either government actions or social norms we need to reframe to make the kind of change that's necessary?
I mean, I think towards government, we need to start pushing towards laws and regulations that are more pro-environmental and focusing on things that do help our environment. So like restoring ecosystems such as wetlands and forests, because those have a huge impact on carbon emissions, and they can actually decrease carbon emissions by a lot. And then with social norms, I think that we need to focus on just like when I talk to someone, they automatically just have this thought that like we can't do anything about it, and like it's an issue, but I can't do anything, so like what's the point of taking action? So we kind of need to change that norm around that and be more like, oh, we can actually do something about it, we can recycle, we can do these things, and set an example of, like by me recycling, I'm setting an example for somebody else to recycle or pick up litter.
Yeah. So how do you respond to the people that, per se, like don't believe in climate change or try to prove it wrong?
Well, I mean, obviously everyone has their views, and there are certain views that we cannot change even through social norms or laws and regulations. There are going to be people that do not believe in climate change or believe that it's a big enough issue to take action. So sometimes we have to respect those beliefs, but the people that we can change, we need to focus on trying, like the people that do know about climate change and believe in it, we need to focus on actually getting them to take initial action.
This is an actual question this time. So one thing that kind of came to mind for me is like our government currently sort of leads their own campaign to go against climate change. And Donald Trump's recent thing with like the whole wind turbines give you cancer like deal, like
Yep.
How would you recommend changing our government's policies in order to better regulate climate change?
Like, how can you influence government policies?
I would say more like, what government policies would you see working well for a change in climate change?
Like carbon taxing. Like when I used that that example that I used, it was shown to like really affect the amount of carbon emissions, and they switched to different fuels because they didn't want to have that tax. And so having more policies around like carbon taxing would have a huge impact.
And then one other thing is like with like electric-based vehicles and solar energy and that kind of stuff, it's in a very expensive market at this time.
Yeah.
So like larger changes at this point in time are very expensive.
Yeah.
And that window of opportunity for us to restore our planet is closing. Like, do you see the market changing at any point?
I think that if we start making initial action, so like recycling, using public transportation, and making it known that this is an issue and that people are taking steps to solutions, it will kind of become this new thing, and they'll make it a lot easier to get solar panels and windmills. Because right now it's not our main focus. People aren't super focused on creating solutions. We know about it, but then we don't really do anything. So I think if we as a society put more effort and notice into it, then they would kind of realize like, oh my gosh, like this is a real issue. We need to make this more accessible and implement more of this into our communities. Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me about this TED Talk was how much a sense of sort of connection and community play into all of these, right? Like the social norms are sort of enforced by the community, and it seemed like the carbon tax sort of like caught on within certain communities and then spread to other communities. And then the same thing with the framing, right? Like it seems like it would be easier to like implement some of these solutions on like a community level. And so I'm just wondering, like, did you see any research, or can you just speculate for me on this idea of connectedness versus like feeling isolated? And was there any research on like, does how connected people feel to their communities impact their level of action on issues like this?
I didn't research any of that, but
Okay.
I'm guessing like the more connected you feel, then it's like the whole thing of not wanting social punishment and not wanting to feel judgment. So if you're connected in a group, that probably means that you want to act like that group and stay connected to that group, so you want to act the way that they're acting. Whereas if you're more isolated, you probably have your own views and standpoints and don't really necessarily need to change who you are because of what other people say.
Can you give us a couple of examples that you found in your research of influencers or celebrities or leaders who have successfully used their power or their social influence to impact climate change?
I mean, we had Protect Our Winters come, and they have a thing called you guys learned about it, but for those who weren't there, they have Hot Planet Cool athletes, and so a bunch of these athletes are going around and going to these schools and educating people about climate change, and then also trying to implement solutions into their own life.
Were there other examples that you came across as you were doing the research?
Is there a marked difference in incentivization between, say, the social norms and not incurring that sort of casting aside as opposed to financial incentivizations? For example, you mentioned social norms as well as the carbon tax. Is one demonstratively more successful than the other?
I mean, I think currently carbon tax is more successful because it kind of makes people do something that they necessarily maybe don't want to do, but they have to do it because they're being taxed. Whereas social norms, it's like there's not a huge movement towards people like picking up littering or recycling or composting, and so it's like there's not this one big idea like you have to recycle, whereas regulations and laws are like you need to do this or you might get taxed, or like yeah.
That's all the time we have for questions. Thank you, Caeley.
Yeah.